On the night Serafina Vale became a wife, her husband abandoned her for another woman. Left alone in their bridal suite, she realized their marriage wasn't built on love. It was a battlefield, and she'd been sent to war unarmed. But humiliation has a way of sharpening a woman into a blade. This is the story of how a discarded bride became a queen no one could ignore. If you want to see how far revenge can take a woman who refuses to break, stay until the end. And don't forget to hit that like button and comment your city below. I want to see how far this story travels. The champagne had gone flat. Serafina stood alone in the center of the penthouse bridal suite, her veil discarded on the marble floor like a piece of broken promise. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline glittered with indifference. 20 stories below, the city continued its relentless pulse, unaware that something inside her had just shattered beyond repair. Her wedding dress, a masterpiece of Italian silk and hand-sewn crystals that had taken 6 months to create, suddenly felt like a costume, like she was playing a role in someone else's fantasy. The bodice constricted around her ribs as she tried to breathe through the humiliation burning in her chest. It had been exactly 43 minutes since Lucien DeMarco, her husband of 6 hours, had walked out. Serafina's hands trembled as she reached for the champagne bottle they were supposed to share. The one with their names engraved on the label in elegant script, Lucien and Serafina united forever. The irony tasted bitter on her tongue. Forever had lasted less than a night. She poured herself a glass with mechanical precision, watching the bubbles rise and burst, just like the hope she'd secretly harbored that maybe, just maybe, this arranged marriage could become something real. How spectacularly naive she'd been. The phone call had come at 11:47 p.m. Serafina had been standing in the bathroom, preparing herself for what should have been their wedding night. She'd chosen the ivory negligee carefully, something elegant rather than provocative. She'd wanted to approach their first intimate moment with dignity, with the possibility of tenderness. Through the closed door, she'd heard Lucien's phone vibrate against the nightstand, once, twice, 3 times. Then his voice, low and urgent. Aria. Just her name, spoken like a prayer, like an invocation, like the only word that mattered in his entire vocabulary. Serafina had frozen, her hand halfway to the bathroom door handle, listening to the one-sided conversation that would define the rest of her life. Slow down. Where are you? A pause. Jesus Christ, stay there. Don't move. I'm coming. The sound of rapid movement, Lucien shedding his tuxedo jacket, changing clothes, his footsteps heavy across the suite's expensive flooring. When Serafina had emerged from the bathroom, still wearing her wedding dress, Lucien was buttoning a fresh shirt with the focused intensity of a man on a mission. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the crystals catching lamplight, or the careful way she'd pinned her dark hair up, leaving her neck exposed. I have to go, he'd said, his voice flat. Professional. The same tone he probably used to dismiss subordinates. Lucien? She'd kept her voice steady despite the earthquake building inside her chest. It's our wedding night. For the first time since the phone rang, he'd looked directly at her. His eyes, that distinctive gray that could shift from storm to steel, showed nothing. No guilt, no apology, just cold calculation. Aria needs me. 3 words. That's all it took to reduce their marriage to rubble before it had even begun. And I don't? The question had escaped before Serafina could stop it, and she'd hated herself immediately for the vulnerability it revealed. Lucien had the decency to hesitate, his hand on the door handle. For a moment, just a moment, something that might have been regret flickered across his features. But then his jaw tightened, and whatever humanity she'd glimpsed disappeared behind the mask he wore so well. You're not in danger. She is. How convenient that she's always in some kind of crisis that requires your immediate attention. Serafina had allowed the bitterness to leak into her tone. Interesting timing, don't you think? On our wedding night? Don't wait up, was all he'd said. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a soft click that sounded louder than any slam could have been. That was 43 minutes ago. Now, standing in her wedding dress with a glass of flat champagne and the ruins of her dignity scattered around her feet, Serafina finally understood what her father had tried to warn her about. The DeMarcos are old money and old power, Marco Vale had told her 3 months ago, when the marriage arrangement was first proposed. Lucien's grandfather built an empire that straddled both sides of the law. That kind of legacy comes with complications. You mean Aria Moretti, Serafina had replied, because she wasn't stupid. She'd done her research. Every society page, every gossip column, every carefully staged photograph had told the story of Lucien DeMarco and his longtime companion. 5 years of public appearances, 5 years of her hand on his arm at charity galas, 5 years of whispered speculation about when he'd finally make her his wife. Instead, he'd chosen Serafina. Or rather, their families had chosen for them. The Vales and the DeMarcos. Two dynasties that had circled each other for decades, sometimes as allies, sometimes as rivals, always as equals. Marco Val had built his fortune in international shipping and real estate development, his operations legitimate but connected enough to command respect in circles where power mattered more than propriety. Alessandro DeMarco, Lucien's father, had inherited an empire that spanned from construction to private security, from luxury hotels to financial investments that generated wealth while operating in the gray spaces where law and influence intersected. A marriage between their children wasn't about love, it was about consolidation, about creating an alliance that would make both families untouchable. Serafina had understood that from the beginning. She'd accepted it with the pragmatism that came from being raised in a world where marriages were mergers and romance was a luxury reserved for people with less at stake. What she hadn't anticipated was the humiliation of being so thoroughly, so publicly dismissed. Not by society. The wedding had been perfect, every detail executed flawlessly. No, the humiliation was private, intimate, the kind that burrows into your bones and reshapes you from the inside out. Serafina set down her champagne glass and walked to the window, pressing her palm against the cool glass. Her reflection stared back at her, a 26-year-old woman in a dress worth more than most people's cars, with dark hair that fell in waves past her shoulders and eyes the color of aged whiskey. She'd been called beautiful her entire life, but tonight, beauty felt like the cruelest joke, because apparently it wasn't enough. Her phone buzzed on the dresser. She knew without looking it would be her mother, checking in with the kind of delicate concern that really meant, "Has he humiliated you yet?" Gabriella Vale had lived through her own strategic marriage, had mastered the art of performing contentment while her husband conducted his business, and occasionally his pleasure elsewhere. She'd tried to prepare her daughter for the same reality. "Men like Lucien DeMarco don't marry for love, darling," she'd said the week before the wedding. "They marry for legacy, for power. If you're lucky, respect comes eventually. Affection, perhaps. But passion? That's what mistresses are for." At the time, Serafina had believed she could be different, that she could be enough. Now she knew better. Now she understood that she'd been brought into this marriage to fulfill a very specific set of requirements: produce heirs, maintain the family's public image, and stay quietly out of the way when his real life demanded his attention. The rage hit her like a physical force. It started in her chest, a spark that caught fire and spread through her entire body until her hands shook and her breathing turned ragged. She wanted to scream. She wanted to tear down the curtains and shatter the windows and destroy every perfect, pristine thing in this monument to her own stupidity. Instead, she channeled every ounce of that fury into absolute stillness, because screaming would change nothing. Destroying beautiful things would only prove she was as fragile as everyone expected her to be. But becoming someone they never saw coming? That would change everything. Serafina walked to the closet where her luggage still sat, unpacked from their honeymoon that was supposed to start tomorrow. The Maldives, 2 weeks of private beaches and attempted intimacy that now felt like a fantasy from someone else's life. She pulled out her laptop and settled onto the sofa, her wedding dress pooling around her like spilled milk. If this was war, she needed intelligence. For the next 3 hours, Serafina did what she should have done months ago. She researched her enemy. Aria Moretti wasn't just Lucien's mistress. She was a carefully constructed persona, a woman who'd positioned herself as indispensable to one of the most powerful men on the eastern seaboard. 28 years old, daughter of a miner family with connections to the old Italian networks, educated at private schools that her family could barely afford. She'd met Lucien at a charity function when she was 23, and he was 28, and from that moment she'd attached herself to him like a barnacle to a ship. The photos told the story. Aria, beautiful in that delicate, ethereal way that made men want to protect her, always touching Lucien's arm, gazing up at him with those wide amber eyes, her blonde hair catching the light like spun gold. In every image, she looked vulnerable, fragile, like a woman who might shatter without the right man to shield her from the world's cruelties. It was masterfully done, Serafina had to admit. The helpless act had worked for 5 years. But as she dug deeper, patterns emerged. The crises that required Lucian's immediate attention happened with suspicious regularity. A stalker that was never caught, a threatening letter that disappeared before authorities could examine it, a near accident that left her shaken but unharmed. Each incident perfectly timed to remind Lucian of his role as her protector, each incident reinforcing the bond between them. And now, tonight, their wedding night, another emergency that conveniently required his presence. Serafina leaned back against the cushions, her mind working through the implications. Arya Moretti was many things, but stupid wasn't one of them. She understood men like Lucien, understood that power and protection were currencies more valuable than love. She'd positioned herself as the damsel, knowing that a man raised to command and control would find purpose in being someone's hero. It was brilliant, really. It was also a vulnerability, because Serafina had been raised in this world too. She'd watched her father navigate power dynamics and strategic relationships her entire life. She'd learned to read people, to identify their weaknesses, to understand what motivated them beneath the surface performances. And she was learning, very quickly, that being underestimated was the greatest advantage a woman could have. The suite door opened at 3:17 a.m. Serafina was still on the sofa, still in her wedding dress, her laptop closed beside her. She'd rehearsed this moment in her head a dozen times, trying different approaches. Tears and accusations, cold silence, righteous anger. In the end, she chose something else entirely. Lucian stopped when he saw her, his tie loosened and his shirt rumpled. He looked exhausted, dark circles under those gray eyes, his jaw shadowed with stubble. For a man who'd just spent hours with another woman, he looked remarkably unhappy. "You waited up," he said, and there was something in his voice that might have been surprise or guilt. Hard to tell. "I couldn't sleep in my wedding dress," Serafina replied evenly. "The crystals are uncomfortable." It was such an absurdly mundane observation that Lucian actually blinked. Whatever he'd been expecting, hysteria, perhaps, or recriminations, clearly this wasn't it. "Serafina, is she all right?" Serafina kept her voice neutral, almost curious. "Arya," Lucian's jaw tightened. "She will be." "Good." Serafina stood, smoothing down the silk of her dress with deliberate care. "That's good. I'd hate for anything terrible to happen to her." The words hung in the air between them, perfectly polite and utterly empty. Lucian studied her with an intensity that might have made her flinch a week ago, but she'd spent the last 3 hours building armor around every vulnerable place inside her, and his scrutiny slid off without purchase. "You're angry," he said finally. "Should I be?" "Most women would be." "I'm not most women, Lucian. I thought you understood that when you agreed to this marriage." Paused, letting the implication settle. "Or was I mistaken? Perhaps you thought I'd be content playing the decorative wife while you live your real life elsewhere." Something flickered in his expression. Respect, maybe, or surprise that she wasn't crumbling the way he'd expected. "This marriage is important to both our families," he said carefully. "I take that seriously. Just not seriously enough to spend your wedding night with your wife." Direct hit. She saw it land, saw him flinch ever so slightly. Arya's situation was urgent. Arya's situations are always urgent. Serafina moved past him toward the bedroom, her dress whispering against the floor. "It's remarkable, really, how often she finds herself in need of rescuing. You must feel very heroic." She didn't wait for his response. She simply walked into the bedroom, closed the door with a soft click that somehow conveyed more dismissal than a slam ever could, and began the process of removing her wedding dress. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd put on this dress imagining one kind of ending to this night. Instead, she was taking it off alone, her marriage already defined by absence rather than presence. But as Serafina carefully hung the dress in the closet, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of finding it crumpled on the floor. She felt something shift inside her. The naive girl who'd walked down the aisle this afternoon was gone, burned away by humiliation and rage and the cold clarity that comes from having your illusions stripped away in the cruelest possible manner. In her place stood someone harder, sharper, someone who understood that in a world built on power and strategy, sentiment was a liability and love was a weakness to be exploited. If Lucien DeMarco wanted a wife who'd stay quietly in the shadows while he played hero to his eternal damsel, he'd chosen wrong. If he thought she'd accept crumbs of his attention while Arya Moretti feasted on his devotion, he didn't know her at all, And if he believed this marriage would be anything like the convenient arrangement he'd envisioned, well, he was about to learn otherwise. Serafina Vale had been raised to lead, not to follow, to command attention, not to beg for it, to build empires, not to decorate someone else's. She'd tried to come into this marriage with grace and openness, willing to build something real despite its transactional origins. That was finished now. From this moment forward, if Lucien wanted a strategic alliance, he'd get one, but on her terms, with her rules. And if Aria Moretti wanted to play the helpless victim who required constant rescue, she was about to discover that Serafina played a different game entirely. She changed into silk pajamas and slipped between the sheets on her side of the bed, a bed that suddenly felt enormous and empty. Through the closed door, she could hear Lucien moving through the suite, the soft sounds of him preparing for sleep. He didn't try to come into the bedroom. Good. She wasn't ready to perform intimacy with a man who'd just chosen another woman over her. But as she lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling while the city lights painted shadows across the walls, Serafina began planning her next move. She'd spent her whole life preparing to step into power. Her father had made sure of that, raising her to understand the family business, teaching her to read contracts and navigate negotiations, ensuring she could hold her own in rooms full of men who thought her pretty face disqualified her from serious consideration. Now she'd put that training to use. If this marriage was a merger, she'd treat it like one. She'd learn every aspect of Lucien's empire. She'd build relationships with his associates, his rivals, his allies. She'd make herself indispensable in ways Aria Moretti could never be. Because here's what neither Lucien nor his precious damsel understood. Serafina didn't need to be rescued. She was perfectly capable of doing the conquering herself. The next morning arrived with the kind of brilliant sunshine that felt personally offensive. Serafina woke alone, which didn't surprise her. What did surprise her was the note on Lucien's pillow, written in his sharp, precise handwriting. Breakfast meeting with the lawyers regarding the Singapore contract. Back by noon. We'll talk then. She stared at the note for a long moment before crumpling it in her fist. Talk. As if conversation could bridge the canyon he'd created between them in a single night. But she showered and dressed with care anyway, choosing a Givenchy sheath dress in deep burgundy that made her look powerful rather than decorative. She swept her hair into a low chignon and applied makeup with strategic precision, enough to look polished, not so much that she seemed to be trying too hard. When her phone rang at 9 a.m., she almost didn't answer. But the caller ID showed her father's name, and Marco Vele didn't make social calls. Good morning, Papa. How are you, daughter? His voice carried that particular blend of affection and assessment that had defined their relationship since she was old enough to understand what being a Vale meant. I'm married. Isn't that the question you should be asking? A low chuckle. I'm asking how you are. The marriage I already know about. I was there, remember? Despite everything, Serafina smiled. I'm fine. Adjusting. I heard Lucien had an emergency last night. No judgment in the words, just observation. But Marco Val never said anything without purpose. Aria Moretti had another crisis. Of course she did. A pause. And how did you handle it? This was the real question. Her father wasn't asking about her emotional state. He was assessing her strategic response. I handled it like a veil, Serafina said quietly. Good. Approval warmed his voice. The DeMarcos are strong allies, Serafina, but they're also proud. Alessandro raised Lucien to value control above all else. Men like that don't respond well to demands or tears. I know. They respond to equals. To strength. Another pause. Show him what he married, daughter. Not what he expected, but what he actually got. After they disconnected, Serafina stood at the window, looking out at the city that sprawled beneath her like a kingdom waiting to be claimed. Her father was right. Tears and recriminations would only confirm whatever assumptions Lucien had made about her. That she was decorative, manageable, content to play the dutiful wife while he conducted his real life elsewhere. But showing him she was more than that, showing him she was formidable in her own right, that would change the equation entirely. The door opened at 11:47 a.m. Serafina was in the living room, her laptop open, reviewing contracts from her father's business that she'd been neglecting during the wedding preparations. She looked up as Lucien entered, noting the surprise that flickered across his face when he saw her working rather than sulking. You're still here, he said. Where else would I be? This is where I live now. She closed her laptop and gave him her full attention. You wanted to talk? Lucian loosened his tie as he crossed to the bar, pouring himself 2 fingers of scotch despite the hour. About last night, there's nothing to discuss, Serafina interrupted smoothly. You had an emergency. You handled it. That's what you do. He turned to face her, glass in hand, clearly thrown by her reaction. You were upset. I was surprised, she corrected. But I understand now. Arya is important to you. You have history. That doesn't disappear because you signed a marriage certificate. The words were perfectly reasonable, but she delivered them with just enough edge to make sure he heard what she wasn't saying. I understand, and I'm making note of exactly where I stand. Serafina, the Singapore deal, she said, changing subjects with the kind of abrupt efficiency that characterized business meetings. Is it finalized? Lucian blinked at the shift. Nearly. Why? Because I was reviewing the maritime contracts my father's company handles in that region, and there might be some synergies worth exploring. If you're expanding your hotel operations there, coordinating with our shipping infrastructure could reduce your logistics costs significantly. For a long moment, Lucian just stared at her. She could see him recalibrating, reassessing, trying to reconcile this version of her with whatever he'd imagined. You studied the Singapore deal? I studied all your current international projects. I assumed you'd expect your wife to be familiar with the family business. She tilted her head slightly. Was I wrong? No. He set down his glass with deliberate care. No, you weren't wrong. Good. Then perhaps we should schedule a proper meeting to discuss potential collaboration. Unless you'd prefer to keep business and marriage entirely separate? She let the question hang, knowing he'd hear the challenge beneath it. Because here's what she understood about men like Lucian DeMarco. They respected competence. They valued strength. They were drawn to people who could match them, challenge them, surprise them. Arya Moretti had positioned herself as his dependent, his responsibility, the delicate thing that needed his protection. Serafina would position herself as his equal, his partner, the formidable force that could build empires alongside him, rather than simply admiring from the sidelines. Different strategies, different outcomes. We'll talk tomorrow, Lucian said finally. I have a lunch meeting in an hour. With? His eyebrow arched at her directness. Alessandro. My father wants to discuss the merger implications. Tell him I said hello, and ask him about the Miami property dispute. My father mentioned it might be worth a joint approach rather than competing bids. Lucian's expression shifted to something that might have been admiration. You really did your homework. I always do, Lucian. It's one of my more irritating qualities. She smiled, but there was steel beneath it. You might want to remember that. Then she picked up her laptop and walked past him into the bedroom, leaving him standing in the living room with his scotch and his assumptions in pieces around his feet. This was how it would be now. She wouldn't compete with Arya Moretti for Lucian's attention. She wouldn't play the wounded wife or the jealous bride. She would simply become too formidable to ignore, too valuable to dismiss, too powerful to be anyone's afterthought. And if he wanted to spend his nights rescuing damsels in distress, fine. She'd spend hers building an empire. We'd see which one he couldn't live without. 3 weeks into her marriage, Serafina walked into the quarterly board meeting for DeMarco International like she owned the room. She didn't, of course. Not yet. But the 12 men seated around the mahogany table didn't need to know that her heart was hammering against her ribs or that she'd rehearsed her opening statement 17 times in the mirror that morning. All they needed to see was a woman who belonged. Lucien's head snapped up when she entered, his conversation with the CFO dying mid-sentence. The surprise in his eyes was deeply satisfying, though Serafina kept her expression neutral as she took the empty seat at the far end of the table. Mrs. DeMarco, Alessandro said from his position at the head of the table, his weathered face creasing into something that might have been amusement. We weren't expecting you. I apologize for the intrusion, Mr. DeMarco. She set her leather portfolio on the table with deliberate precision. But as Lucien's wife, I thought it appropriate to familiarize myself with the family's operations. I hope that's acceptable. It wasn't a request. The phrasing made that clear. Alessandro's eyes, the same storm gray as his son's, gleamed with something that looked like approval. By all means, we're discussing the Miami expansion. The property dispute with the Castellano Group, Serafina said smoothly. I'm familiar with it. In fact, I may have a solution that benefits both parties. The room went silent. Across the table, Lucien was watching her with an intensity that would have made her squirm a month ago. Now she met his gaze steadily, letting him see that the woman who'd stood alone in her wedding dress was gone. This was who remained. For the next 40 minutes, Serafina outlined a proposal she'd spent the last 2 weeks developing. A joint venture between DeMarco International and Vail Shipping that would give both families access to the Miami waterfront property while cutting the Castellanos out entirely. It was elegant, ruthless, and would save both companies millions in legal fees. When she finished, the silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Then Alessandro started laughing. "Marco didn't tell me he'd raised a shark," the older man said, genuine admiration warming his voice. "Lucien, your wife just solved a problem we've been wrestling with for 6 months." "So I noticed." Lucien's tone was impossible to read, but his eyes never left Serafina's face. The meeting continued, but the dynamic had shifted. The men around the table no longer dismissed her presence or spoke over her when she asked questions. They'd seen what she could do. And in a world built on competence and results, that mattered more than gender or age or the fact that she was supposed to be decorative rather than dangerous. When the meeting finally adjourned, Serafina gathered her materials with unhurried grace. She could feel Lucien approaching before he spoke, his presence like a shift in atmospheric pressure. "That was impressive," he said quietly. "Thank you." She slid her portfolio under her arm and turned to face him. "I told you I'd done my homework." "You did more than homework. That proposal was professional-grade strategy." He paused, studying her. "How long have you been working on it?" "Since our wedding night." The words came out softer than she'd intended, carrying more weight than she'd meant to reveal. "I needed something to occupy my time." Something flickered in Lucien's expression. Regret, maybe? Or the ghost of guilt. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and Serafina watched his entire demeanor change. She didn't need to ask who was calling. "I have to take this," he said, already moving toward the door. "Of course you do." Serafina kept her voice light, empty of accusation. "I'll see you at home." He paused at the threshold, looking back at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Then he was gone, and she was left standing in the empty boardroom with Alessandro, who was watching her with the keen assessment of a man who'd built an empire by reading people. "Walk with me," the older DeMarco said. It wasn't a request. They moved through the building's executive floors in silence, Alessandro's presence commanding deference from every employee they passed. Serafina matched his pace, her heels clicking against marble with the same measured rhythm as his expensive Italian shoes. "You're angry," Alessandro said finally, as they entered his private office, a corner suite with windows overlooking the East River. "I'm focused," Serafina corrected. "On what?" "On being valuable." She met his gaze directly. "Your son married me for strategic reasons. I'm ensuring the strategy pays off." Alessandro poured 2 glasses of wine from a bottle that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He handed one to Serafina and settled into the leather chair behind his desk. "Lucien is my only son," he said quietly. "I raised him to lead, to command, to never show weakness. Those qualities make him formidable in business. In personal relationships." He trailed off meaningfully. "They make him loyal to the wrong people," Serafina finished. "Aria Moretti is a mistake." Alessandro's bluntness startled her. "I told him that 5 years ago. I told him again when we arranged your marriage. But my son has always had a weakness for things that need protecting." "I don't need protecting, Mr. DeMarco." "I know. I can see that." He sipped his wine thoughtfully. "Marco raised you well. You think like we do, strategically, long term. That's why I supported this marriage despite Lucien's attachments." "Does it bother you?" Serafina asked carefully. "That your son left his wedding night to be with another woman?" "It bothers me that he's too blind to see what he has." Alessandro's voice carried an edge of frustration. "But you're handling it correctly. Don't compete for his attention. Make him compete for yours." The advice settled over her like armor. They talked for another hour, about business, about family legacy, about the delicate balance of power that held their world together. By the time Serafina left Alessandro's office, she understood something crucial. Lucien's father saw her as an asset, possibly even as the daughter he'd never had. That alliance was worth more than gold. The penthouse was empty when she returned that evening. No surprise there. Lucien's absences had become a pattern she could set her watch by. Late meetings that ran later, emergencies that required his personal attention. Phone calls that pulled him away from dinners and conversations and any moment that might have built intimacy between them. Serafina poured herself a glass of wine and settled onto the terrace, watching the sun paint the city in shades of amber and gold. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Dinner this Friday? Your father wants to discuss the Miami project." She smiled. Word traveled fast in their circles. "I'll be there." Another text, this one from an unknown number. "This is Victoria Castellano. Alessandro gave me your contact. I'd like to meet for coffee." Serafina stared at the message, her strategic mind already working through the implications. Victoria Castellano, daughter of the family they just outmaneuvered in the Miami deal. Either this was an attempt at retaliation or something more interesting. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The St. Regis. The response came immediately. "See you there." The game was evolving, expanding beyond just Lucien and Arya. Serafina was building her own network, her own sphere of influence. And every connection she made, every alliance she forged, every person who saw her as capable rather than decorative was a brick in the empire she was constructing. Lucien came home after midnight. Serafina heard the door open from her position in bed, heard him move quietly through the suite. He paused outside the bedroom door. She could see his shadow in the gap beneath it, but he didn't enter. He never did anymore. They'd fallen into a strange pattern, this husband and wife who shared a home, but not a life. Polite in public, professional in business meetings, and carefully distant in private. Like roommates with a marriage license and a merger agreement. Some nights, Serafina wondered if this was how it would always be. If she'd spend the rest of her life sleeping alone in a king-size bed, building empires during the day and coming home to emptiness at night. Other nights, she reminded herself that alone was better than abandoned. That respect earned through competence was more valuable than affection given as an afterthought. Tonight was one of the latter nights. Victoria Castellano was not what Serafina expected. The woman who rose from the corner table at the St. Regis was tall and striking, with the kind of presence that made people turn and stare. She wore a black suit that probably cost what most people earned in a month, and her handshake was firm enough to communicate equality without aggression. "Thank you for meeting me," Victoria said as they settled into their seats. "I wasn't sure you would." "I'm curious," Serafina admitted. "Your family just lost a very lucrative deal because of a proposal I made. This is either revenge or recruitment." Victoria's laugh was genuine. "I like you already. It's recruitment, sort of." She stirred her espresso thoughtfully. "My father is furious about the Miami situation, but I think you did us a favor. We were overextended, and that property would have bled us dry within 2 years. You saved us from ourselves." "That wasn't my intention." "No, your intention was to strengthen your position with the DeMarcos while benefiting your father's company." "Smart play." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "But it also showed me something. You're not just a pretty face they married off to seal an alliance. You actually understand how this world works. And that matters to you because? Because women like us are rare in these circles." Victoria's expression turned serious. "We're daughters of powerful men, raised to be strategic assets. Most of us learn to play the role, smile, look beautiful, marry well, produce heirs. But some of us want more." Serafina recognized the truth in those words because she'd been living it her entire life. The constant pressure to be ornamental rather than essential. The assumption that her value lay in her last name and her ability to cement alliances through marriage rather than in her mind or her capabilities. "What are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "An alliance. Not between our families. That ship has sailed. Between us." Victoria pulled out her phone and showed Serafina a photograph of 5 women standing together at what looked like a charity gala. "We meet once a month. Share information, resources, opportunities. Help each other navigate this world that was built by our fathers, but will eventually be ours to manage." Serafina studied the faces in the photograph. Women she recognized from various social functions, daughters of families that operated in the same circles as the Vales and DeMarcos. "Why are you recruiting me?" "Because you just walked into a room full of men who've been running DeMarco International for decades and made them listen to you. Because you're married to one of the most powerful men on the Eastern Seaboard, but you're building your own influence instead of just basking in his. Because you're exactly the kind of woman we need." The offer was tempting, more than tempting. The idea of having allies, of building a network that existed independent of her marriage or her father's name, resonated with everything Serafina had been trying to achieve. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Fair enough? Victoria slid a business card across the table. Next meeting is in 2 weeks. The address is on the back. Show up or don't, no pressure. But I think you'll find we have a lot to offer each other. They talked for another hour, the conversation ranging from business to personal observations about navigating their complicated world. By the time Serafina left the St. Regis, she had a new understanding of the landscape she was operating in. She wasn't alone in this. There were other women fighting the same battles, building the same bridges, refusing to accept that their only value was decorative. That knowledge felt like oxygen after being underwater. The charity gala that Friday was the kind of event Serafina used to attend as her father's daughter. Now she arrived as Lucien's wife, and the difference in how people treated her was stark and instructive. Men who'd barely acknowledged her existence before now wanted to discuss business ventures. Women who'd dismissed her as competition for their daughters now sought her friendship. The power dynamics had shifted, and Serafina was learning to navigate them with increasing skill. Lucien, resplendent in a custom tuxedo, played his role perfectly, attentive without being effusive, present without being possessive. To anyone watching, they looked like exactly what they were supposed to be, a powerful couple, united in purpose if not in passion. The illusion shattered when Arya Moretti arrived. Serafina saw her first, a flash of gold silk and blonde hair across the ballroom. The other woman moved through the crowd with the practiced grace of someone who'd attended 1,000 events like this, accepting greetings and air kisses with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Those eyes found Lucien immediately, with the unerring accuracy of a heat-seeking missile. Serafina felt Lucien tense beside her, his entire body language shifting in ways only someone watching closely would notice. The hand at her waist tightened fractionally, his jaw clenched. His focus, which had been on the conversation with a potential investor, fragmented. "Excuse me," he murmured, already moving away. Serafina watched him cross the ballroom with long, purposeful strides, watched Arya's face light up when she saw him approaching, watched the way her delicate hand found his arm, the way she leaned in close to whisper something that made his expression soften in ways it never did around Serafina. The rational part of her brain cataloged the interaction with clinical detachment. This was useful information. Observing their dynamic, understanding the nature of their connection, would help her strategize more effectively. The part of her brain that was still just a woman standing alone at a gala while her husband gravitated toward another woman felt something sharper than observation. "He's an idiot." Serafina turned to find Victoria Castellano beside her, champagne glass in hand and assessment in her eyes. "That's not particularly helpful," Serafina said quietly. "No, but it's true." Victoria followed her gaze across the ballroom. Arya Moretti has been playing the damsel in distress routine for 5 years. It's gotten old for everyone except Lucien, apparently. He cares about her. He's addicted to being needed by her. That's different. Victoria's tone was matter-of-fact rather than sympathetic. Men like Lucien DeMarco are raised to solve problems, to fix things, to be the hero. Arya figured that out early and positioned herself as his eternal rescue project. It's brilliant, really. As long as she stays broken, he stays invested. The analysis was so accurate it stung. "And what am I supposed to do?" Serafina asked, hating the vulnerability that leaked into the question. "Compete with that?" "No. You do exactly what you're already doing. Build something so substantial he can't ignore it." Victoria gestured subtly toward a cluster of women near the bar. "Come meet the others. Let him stand over there playing hero. We have more interesting things to discuss." The group Victoria led her to was the same women from the photograph. 5 daughters of powerful families, each one navigating the complicated intersection of legacy and ambition. They welcomed Serafina with the easy camaraderie of people who understood what it was like to be simultaneously privileged and constrained by their world. For the next 2 hours, Serafina forgot about Lucien and Arya. She talked business with women who understood the complexities of their family's operations. She discussed strategy with people who saw her as an equal rather than an accessory. She laughed at observations that were sharp and insightful rather than the vapid small talk that usually dominated these events. When she finally glanced across the ballroom again, Lucien was watching her. Not Arya, who was still at his side, her hand possessive on his arm. Her. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and something passed between them, recognition, perhaps, or surprise. As if he was seeing her clearly for the first time and realizing she was nothing like what he'd expected. Serafina raised her champagne glass in a silent toast, then turned her attention back to Victoria's story about outmaneuvering a sexist board member. If Lucien wanted to watch her thrive without him, let him. She had better things to do than pine for a man who'd chosen his mistress over his wife. The car ride home was silent. Lucien sat beside her in the back of the town car, his expression unreadable in the darkness. Serafina kept her gaze on the city lights streaming past, refusing to be the one who broke first. "You've been busy," Lucien said finally. "I have. Your father appreciated my Miami proposal. It's moving forward." "I wasn't talking about business." He shifted to face her. "Victoria Castellano, that group you were with. What is that?" "Networking," Serafina said simply. "Something I should have been doing from the beginning." "With the Castellanos?" After I just outmaneuvered them, Victoria saw an opportunity for future collaboration. She finally looked at him. "Not everything is warfare, Lucien. Sometimes it's just strategy." He studied her in the dim light, and she wondered what he saw. The decorative wife he'd expected, or the formidable woman she was becoming? "You've changed," he said quietly. "No, I've just stopped pretending to be what you wanted me to be." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, carrying 3 weeks of carefully controlled frustration. "You wanted a strategic alliance. You have one. I'm good at this, Lucien. Building relationships, identifying opportunities, making deals that benefit our families. I'm doing exactly what you married me for." "That's not—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with how to finish that sentence. "Not what?" Serafina challenged. "Not what you wanted? Not what you expected? What did you think would happen when you left me alone night after night? That I'd sit quietly in the penthouse waiting for you to remember you have a wife?" The car pulled up to their building, and Serafina didn't wait for the driver to open her door. She let herself out and walked into the lobby with her head high, not looking back to see if Lucien followed. He caught up with her at the elevator, his hand on her arm stopping her before she could step inside. "Serafina, don't." She pulled free gently but firmly. "Don't apologize if you don't mean it. Don't make promises you won't keep. And don't ask me to be less than I am just because it makes you uncomfortable." "That's not what I was going to say." "Then what were you going to say, Lucien?" She turned to face him fully, letting him see the anger she'd been banking for weeks. "That you're sorry? That things will change? That Arya means nothing?" "Arya is complicated." "Arya is a choice," Serafina interrupted. "Every time you leave to go to her, every time you take her call in the middle of our conversations, every time you prioritize her crisis over our marriage, those are choices you're making. Own them." The elevator arrived with a soft chime. Serafina stepped inside, and this time, Lucien didn't follow. As the doors closed between them, she saw his expression, stunned, conflicted, perhaps even regretful. But regret without change was just another empty promise, and Serafina was done accepting those. The next morning, she woke to find the bed still empty. Lucien had either slept in the guest room or not come home at all. She didn't particularly care which. Her phone showed 3 missed calls from her mother and a text from Victoria. "The Miami deal is brilliant. My father wants to schedule a meeting." Serafina smiled. This was what mattered, not her husband's nocturnal whereabouts, but the empire she was building brick by strategic brick. She dressed in a Tom Ford suit that made her look like she could buy and sell companies before breakfast, then headed to the Vale estate for the lunch her mother had insisted on. Gabriella Vale was waiting in the sunroom, elegant and composed as always, with the kind of beauty that had survived 2 decades of strategic marriage to a powerful man. "You look tired, darling," her mother said by way of greeting. "I've been busy." "So I've heard. Alessandro DeMarco can't stop singing your praises, says you have the sharpest strategic mind he's encountered in years." Serafina poured herself tea from the service laid out on the table. "He's being generous. He's being accurate." Gabriella studied her daughter with eyes that missed nothing. "How is married life?" "Exactly what you prepared me for." "Ah." Her mother's expression softened with something that might have been sympathy. "He's still seeing her." It wasn't a question. "Yes. And you're handling it by becoming indispensable to his family business." "I'm handling it by becoming indispensable, period." Serafina met her mother's gaze directly. "You taught me that depending on a man's affection was foolish. That real power comes from being valuable, not beloved. I'm following your advice." Gabriella was quiet for a long moment, her delicate fingers tracing patterns on her teacup. "I did teach you that," she said finally. "And I was right. Being valuable is safer than being loved. But Serafina," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "don't let safety become a cage. Don't let strategy replace the possibility of something real. He chose someone else, Mama. On our wedding night. What am I supposed to do with that? Make him regret it." The steel in her mother's voice was unexpected. "Not by crying or begging or making yourself smaller. Make him regret it by becoming so magnificent he can't look away. By being so formidable that every day he doesn't choose you feels like a loss he can't recover from." The advice settled into Serafina's bones like truth. They talked for another hour, her mother sharing observations about power and marriage that came from decades of navigating similar waters. When Serafina finally left the estate, she felt fortified, armed with the wisdom of a woman who'd survived her own strategic marriage and emerged with her dignity intact. The penthouse was still empty when she returned. Another late meeting, according to the text from Lucien. Another evening alone. Serafina didn't mind anymore. Alone had become her sanctuary, the space where she could drop the performance and just be, where she could work on her projects without explaining herself, where she could build her empire without anyone watching. She was reviewing contracts when her phone rang. Victoria, this time. "There's a situation," the other woman said without preamble. "Aria Moretti just got arrested for cocaine possession at a club downtown." Serafina's blood went cold. "What?" "It's all over the news. Lucien is apparently at the precinct trying to make it go away, but this one's messy. There were cameras, witnesses. The press is going to have a field day." After they disconnected, Serafina sat in the silence of the penthouse, processing this information. This wasn't just another of Aria's manufactured crises. This was real, serious, the kind of scandal that could damage not just Aria, but the entire DeMarco reputation by association. And Lucien was there, playing hero as always, trying to fix it. Part of her. The part that was still just a woman hurt by her husband's choices. Wanted to feel vindicated. To watch this blow up in both their faces. But the strategic part of her brain, the part her father and Alessandro had trained, understood something else. This was an opportunity. Not to attack, but to demonstrate exactly what kind of partner she could be. Serafina picked up her phone and made a call she'd been saving for exactly this kind of moment. "Marcus, it's Serafina Vale. I need a favor." Marcus Reeves was a fixer, the kind of man who operated in the shadows of power, making problems disappear before they metastasized into disasters. He owed Marco Vale 3 significant favors, and Serafina was about to call in one of them. "The Moretti situation," she said when he answered. "I need you to handle the press." "I'm already getting calls from Lucien DeMarco's people," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the gravelly texture of too many late nights and strong coffee. "This one's messy, Serafina. Possession with intent, potential distribution charges. The girl's in real trouble." "I know. That's why I need you to control the narrative before it controls us." She kept her voice steady, professional. "Spin it as a setup. Someone with a grudge trying to damage her reputation. Make her sympathetic. Even if it's not true? Is anything ever really true in our world, Marcus? Or just the version that gets told most convincingly?" Serafina moved to the window, watching the city lights blur through the glass. "Besides, I'm not asking you to lie. I'm asking you to find the angle that protects my family's interests." There was a pause, and she could almost hear Marcus reassessing her. She wasn't Marco Vale's sheltered daughter anymore, and she definitely wasn't the decorative bride everyone had expected Lucien to acquire. "This is going to cost you," he said finally. "Put it on my account." "You have your own account now?" "I do. Anything else you need?" "Just confirmation that you know what you're doing. If this blows back, it won't." Serafina's confidence wasn't false bravado. She'd spent the last hour running scenarios, calculating risks, understanding exactly what this move would cost and what it might gain. "Handle the press. I'll handle everything else." After disconnecting, she made 2 more calls. The first to Alessandro, informing him of the situation and her solution. The second to her father, letting him know she'd activated Marcus on behalf of the DeMarco family. Then she waited. Lucien arrived home at 3 in the morning, looking like he'd aged a decade in the span of 6 hours. His tie was gone, his shirt rumpled, and exhaustion carved deep lines around his eyes. He stopped short when he found Serafina in the living room, still dressed, a pot of coffee on the table beside her laptop. "You're awake," he said, surprise evident in his tone. "I heard about Arya." Serafina closed her laptop with deliberate care. "Is she all right?" Lucian stared at her like she'd spoken a foreign language. "You heard. It's all over the news. Or it was until about an hour ago when the narrative started shifting." She poured him coffee without asking if he wanted it, sliding the cup across the table. "Now it's a story about a young woman being targeted by someone with a vendetta. Sympathetic. Manageable. How—" He stopped, realization dawning across his features. "You did that." "I made some calls. The press is contained, the charges will likely be reduced with the right legal pressure, and your family's reputation remains intact." She met his gaze steadily. "You're welcome." Lucian sank into the chair across from her, coffee cup cradled between his hands like a lifeline. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. Confusion, maybe, mixed with something that might have been gratitude or possibly guilt. "Why?" The single word carried the weight of everything unspoken between them. "Because we're married, Lucian. Because your problems are my problems, whether I like it or not." Serafina's voice was calm, matter of fact. "Because letting this destroy your family would hurt my family by extension. And because—" She paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Because I understand that you care about her, and I'm not cruel enough to want to see her suffer just because I'm angry with you." The honesty seemed to stun him into silence. "I don't deserve that," he said finally, his voice rough with something that sounded like self-recrimination. "No, you don't. But marriage isn't about deserving, is it? It's about strategy, about alliances, about protecting what matters." She stood, gathering her laptop. "Get some sleep. We have that lunch with the Singapore investors tomorrow, and you look like hell." She was halfway to the bedroom when his voice stopped her. "Serafina." She turned, waiting. "Thank you." The words were simple, but the emotion behind them was complex. Gratitude tangled with regret. Respect mixed with something that might have been the first stirrings of real awareness. "Don't thank me, Lucien. Just remember what I'm capable of the next time you're deciding who's valuable to you." The words hung in the air between them as she disappeared into the bedroom, leaving him alone with his coffee and his thoughts. The Singapore lunch was a masterclass in performance. Serafina arrived looking flawless in a cream Chanel suit, her dark hair swept into an elegant updo that showcased diamond earrings, a wedding gift from Alessandro. She greeted the investors with perfect poise, her handshake firm, her smile warm but professional. Lucien, beside her, played his role equally well. They moved through the meal like a synchronized unit, finishing each other's sentences when discussing the joint venture, presenting a united front that made the investors visibly comfortable. No one watching would have guessed that they'd spent the previous night on opposite sides of a crisis, that they slept in separate rooms, that their marriage was more business partnership than romantic union. "Your wife is remarkable," David Chen, the lead investor, said to Lucien during dessert. "My research indicated this marriage was strategic, but I see now it's also quite advantageous. She understands the Asian markets better than most people twice her age." "She's full of surprises," Lucien agreed, and there was something in his tone that made Serafina glance his way. He was watching her with an intensity that felt different from his usual detached observation, like he was actually seeing her rather than just noting her presence. After the investors left, Lucien suggested they walk through Central Park despite the autumn chill. Serafina agreed, curious about this shift in his behavior. They walked in silence for several minutes, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath their feet providing a rhythm to their steps. Around them, the city continued its relentless pulse, but here, in this pocket of manufactured nature, they existed in a strange bubble of almost intimacy. "I owe you an apology," Lucien said finally. "You owe me several." Serafina kept her gaze forward. "Which one are you referring to?" "All of them." He stopped walking, turning to face her. "Our wedding night. Every night since. The assumption that you'd be content being ornamental. The way I've treated this marriage like an inconvenience instead of a partnership." "Why now?" She studied his face, looking for the calculation behind the words. "What changed?" "You did. Or maybe I finally noticed what you've been all along." Lucien shoved his hands into his pockets, a gesture that seemed almost vulnerable. "Last night, when you fixed a problem that wasn't yours to fix, when you protected someone who's been the reason I've neglected you, I realized I've been catastrophically stupid." "Yes, you have been." Serafina wasn't interested in making this easy for him. But realization doesn't equal change, Lucy Shen. I've heard apologies before. They're cheap without action. You're right. He nodded slowly. So tell me what you want. What would actual change look like? The question caught her off guard. She'd spent weeks building armor, constructing walls, becoming formidable enough that his neglect couldn't touch her. Now he was asking her to articulate what would breach those defenses, and she found herself suddenly uncertain. I want to matter, she said finally, the words raw and honest in a way she hadn't intended. Not as a strategic asset or a convenient wife or someone you remember exists when it's professionally advantageous. I want to matter the way she matters to you. Lucian flinched like she'd struck him. Arya is someone you leave me for, someone whose crises take priority over our marriage, someone you've been choosing over me since the moment we said our vows. Serafina's voice remained steady despite the emotion churning beneath. I'm not asking you to stop caring about her. I'm just asking you to start caring about me. I do care. You care about what I can do for your family business. You care about the strategic advantage our marriage provides. But do you care about me, Lucian, as a person rather than a piece on your chessboard? The silence that followed was answer enough. Serafina resumed walking, and after a moment, Lucian fell into step beside her. They completed the loop around the park without speaking again, the weight of honesty settling between them like a third presence. When they returned to the penthouse, Serafina found a massive flower arrangement waiting in the foyer, 24 white roses with a card in Arya's delicate handwriting. Thank you for your kindness. I don't deserve it, but I'm grateful. Serafina stared at the flowers for a long moment, something cold and sharp crystallizing in her chest. Arya Moretti was thanking her. The woman who'd been the wedge in her marriage from day one was expressing gratitude for the help Serafina had provided. The irony was almost perfect. You should throw them away, Lucienne said quietly from behind her. Why? They're beautiful. Serafina picked up the card, reading it again. And she's right. I was kind. Kinder than she deserved, certainly kinder than you deserved. But I wasn't kind for either of you. Then why? Because I needed to prove something to myself. She set the card down carefully. That I could be bigger than my anger, that I could make strategic decisions even when my emotions wanted me to watch everything burn, that I could be the kind of person who builds rather than destroys. She turned to face him fully, and the look in her eyes made Lucian take a step back. But don't mistake strategic kindness for forgiveness, Lucian. And don't mistake my ability to help her for acceptance of your relationship with her. I did what was necessary to protect our families. That's all. The flowers stayed in the foyer, a constant reminder of the complicated tangle of their situation. Serafina walked past them every day without a second glance, but she knew Lucian noticed them. Knew they bothered him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. Good. Let him be bothered. The monthly meeting with Victoria's group happened 3 days later, in a private dining room at an upscale restaurant in Soho. 6 women gathered around the table, each one a daughter of power, each one navigating the complicated intersection of legacy and ambition. Victoria made introductions. Elena Russo, whose family controlled a significant portion of the city's construction industry. Isabel Chen, daughter of a tech magnate who'd built his empire on both coasts. Natasha Volkov, whose father's investment firm managed billions. Sienna DeLuca, whose family's influence in municipal politics stretched back 3 generations. And Serafina, newest member of this unofficial alliance. Welcome officially, Victoria said, raising her wine glass, to the daughters who refused to be decorative. They drank to that, and then the real conversation began. These women weren't playing at power. They were cultivating it with the same strategic precision their fathers had used to build their empires. They shared intelligence about business opportunities, warned each other about bad actors in their circles, and collaborated on ventures that benefited their respective families. The Moretti situation, Isabel said, turning to Serafina, that was impressive damage control. Marcus Reeves doesn't take jobs for just anyone. My father has history with him, Serafina explained. I simply leveraged an existing relationship to help your husband's mistress avoid serious charges. Natasha's tone was neutral, but her eyes were sharp. That took either tremendous strategic thinking or tremendous stupidity. Which was it? Both, probably. Serafina smiled without humor. But it accomplished what I needed. It demonstrated my value to the DeMarco family while putting Arya Moretti in my debt. She knows I saved her. That's a power dynamic worth cultivating. Victoria nodded approvingly. See? This is why we recruited you. Most women in your position would have let her burn. You turned a crisis into leverage. Speaking of leverage, Elena said, pulling out her tablet, I've been tracking some interesting movement in the waterfront development sector. Serafina, your Miami proposal got people's attention. There might be opportunities for broader collaboration. For the next 2 hours, they discussed business with the kind of sophisticated analysis that would have impressed their fathers. They were good at this, better than most people expected daughters to be. And they were building something that existed entirely independent of their family names or their marriages. Something that was theirs. When the meeting concluded, Victoria walked Serafina to her car. You're fitting in well, the other woman observed. Better than I expected, actually. Why did you expect otherwise? Because you're newer to this than the rest of us. Elena's been running point on her family's operations since she was 22. Isabel basically manages her father's West Coast portfolio. Natasha has her own investment fund. Sienna is being groomed to run for city council. Victoria paused. You're still establishing yourself. Which means I have more to prove. Serafina met her gaze directly. I'm not afraid of that. No, you're not. That's what makes you dangerous. Victoria's smile was approving. Keep doing what you're doing. Build your empire. Make yourself indispensable. And when the time comes to choose between their comfort and your power, choose power every single time. The advice echoed her mother's words, and Serafina filed it away alongside all the other strategic wisdom she was accumulating. The charity auction that weekend was another test of her evolving skills. Serafina arrived alone. Lucien was handling some emergency with the Singapore contract, wearing a Valentino gown that made her look like she could command armies. The event was a who's who of New York society. Old money mixing with new, power brokers circulating like sharks in evening wear. She worked the room with practiced ease, building on relationships she'd started at previous events, strengthening alliances that would benefit both Vale and DeMarco interests. People were starting to recognize her not as Marco Vale's daughter or Lucien DeMarco's wife, but as Serafina, a force in her own right. You're making quite an impression, Alessandro said, materializing at her elbow during the silent auction. I've had 3 people ask me about potential partnerships that involve you specifically. Are you surprised? Delighted, actually. I told Lucien he'd married well. I'm not sure he believed me at first. Alessandro studied the auction items with casual interest. He's beginning to understand now, I think. Understanding and acting on that understanding are different things. True. The older DeMarco turned to face her fully. My son is brilliant in business, but occasionally obtuse in personal matters. He spent 5 years in a relationship that made him feel necessary. You make him feel unnecessary, and that's threatening to a man like him. I don't make him feel unnecessary. I make him realize I don't need him. Serafina kept her voice low enough that nearby conversations wouldn't carry their words. There's a difference. Is there? Because from where I'm standing, the effect is the same. He's finally paying attention to his wife. Alessandro's smile was knowing. Whether that attention stems from respect or fear of losing what he's taken for granted, the result benefits you either way. Before Serafina could respond, commotion rippled through the ballroom. Raised voices near the entrance, people turning to look, the careful veneer of society manners cracking to reveal the gossip-hungry nature beneath. Aria Moretti had arrived. She stood in the entrance wearing a dress that probably cost more than most people's cars, her blonde hair swept up to expose a delicate neck, her amber eyes scanning the room with the kind of calculated vulnerability she'd perfected over years of practice. And she was heading straight for Alessandro and Serafina. Mr. DeMarco, Aria said, her voice carrying just the right note of grateful humility. I hoped I might see you tonight. I wanted to thank you personally for your family's support during my recent difficulties. You should be thanking my daughter-in-law, Alessandro replied smoothly. She's the one who orchestrated your rescue. Aria's gaze shifted to Serafina, and for just a moment, something hard and assessing flickered behind those amber eyes before the mask of gratitude slid back into place. Mrs. DeMarco, I sent flowers, but I fear they were inadequate to express my appreciation. She smiled, and it was perfect, warm, sincere, with just a hint of self-deprecating embarrassment. You helped me when you had every reason not to. That kind of grace is rare. Serafina recognized a performance when she saw one. She'd grown up watching power players manipulate perception, and Arya Moretti was very, very good at it. Two could play this game. I'm glad I could help, Serafina said warmly, matching Arya's tone perfectly. No one deserves to be victimized the way you were. I hope you're recovering from the ordeal. I am, thanks to the support of people like you and Lucien. Arya's hand fluttered to her throat in a gesture that managed to be both delicate and pointed. He's been wonderful through all of this. So protective, so concerned. I don't know what I'd do without him. There it was. The subtle reminder of her claim. The gentle assertion of her position in Lucien's life. Arya was marking territory with the kind of elegant aggression that looked like gratitude to anyone not paying close attention. Serafina saw Alessandro stiffen slightly beside her, his face hardening in displeasure at Arya's presumption. But she didn't need him to fight this battle. Lucien is good at taking care of people who need him, Serafina agreed pleasantly. It's one of his best qualities. Though lately he's been learning that some of us prefer partnership to protection. It's been an interesting evolution to witness. The words were mild, conversational even, but Arya heard the steel beneath them. Her smile never wavered, but her eyes sharpened with the recognition of a worthy opponent. How fortunate you are then to have a husband who can adapt. Arya's tone remained sweet, but the challenge was unmistakable. Some men never learn to see beyond their initial impressions. And some women never evolve beyond their initial strategies, Serafina countered smoothly. But we all play the hands we're dealt, don't we? The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Alessandro looked like he was watching a chess match, fascination and approval warring on his face. Then Arya laughed, a delicate tinkling sound that somehow conveyed both amusement and surrender. I can see why Lucien married you, she said, and for the first time her smile seemed almost genuine. You're much more formidable than I expected. And you're exactly as formidable as I expected, Serafina replied. Which is why I'm sure we'll find a way to coexist without destroying each other. It would be inconvenient for everyone if we didn't. Arya studied her for a long moment, reassessing with the same calculating intelligence Serafina had seen in the boardroom with Alessandro's executives. Indeed it would, she agreed finally. Then, with a graceful nod to both of them, she moved deeper into the party, leaving Serafina and Alessandro alone. That, Alessandro said quietly, was masterfully done. You didn't back down, but you also didn't escalate. You set boundaries without declaring war. Because war would be messy and ultimately counterproductive, Serafina said. I'd rather have her uncertain of my intentions than actively working against me. You've learned quickly. I've had good teachers. She glanced at him. Though I suspect Arya Moretti just became much more dangerous now that she sees me as a threat rather than an obstacle. Undoubtedly, but that's a problem for another day. Alessandro touched her elbow lightly, guiding her toward the bar. Tonight, let's celebrate your first successful territorial negotiation. You handled yourself like you were born to this. Maybe I was, Serafina said softly. Because the truth was, she didn't feel like she was pretending anymore. The strategic thinking, the careful maneuvering, the ability to read people and situations and respond with precision, it all felt natural now. Like she'd been wearing someone else's skin for 26 years and had finally found the one that fit. The girl who'd walked down the aisle hoping for love was gone completely now, burned away in the crucible of humiliation and necessity. What remained was a woman who understood power and how to wield it, who could stand toe-to-toe with Arya Moretti and make the other woman blink first, who could navigate the treacherous waters of family legacy and strategic marriage without losing herself in the process. Serafina Vale DeMarco was becoming dangerous, and the best part was that hardly anyone saw it coming. The threat came on a Tuesday morning, delivered in an unmarked envelope slipped under the penthouse door. Serafina found it while Lucien was in the shower, preparing for an early meeting with the Tokyo investors. She almost dismissed it as junk mail, but something about the weight of the envelope, the quality of the paper, made her pause. Inside was a single photograph. Her blood turned to ice. The image showed her leaving the St. Regis after her first meeting with Victoria Castellano. Nothing incriminating on its surface, just two women having coffee. But the angle of the shot, the deliberate framing, carried an implicit threat. Someone had been watching. Someone knew her movements, her associations, her routines. Beneath the photograph, a message in cut-out magazine letters like something from a crime thriller. Stay in your lane or lose more than your pride. Serafina's hands trembled as she studied the image, her strategic mind already racing through possibilities. Who would benefit from intimidating her? Who saw her growing influence as a threat worth neutralizing? The list was longer than she'd like to admit. She was still holding the photograph when Lucien emerged from the bedroom, adjusting his cufflinks. He stopped when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" Serafina handed him the envelope without a word. She watched his expression shift from curiosity to concern to cold fury in the space of 3 seconds. His jaw clenched so tightly she could see the muscle jump beneath his skin. "When did this arrive?" His voice was dangerously quiet. "Just now. It was under the door." Lucien was already moving, pulling his phone from his pocket, his entire demeanor transforming from businessman to something harder, more lethal. This was the side of him she rarely saw. The man who'd inherited an empire built on both legitimate business and the kind of power that operated in shadows. "Cancel my morning meetings," he said into the phone, "and get Marcus Chen here immediately. I don't care what he's doing." A pause. "No, this can't wait." He disconnected and turned back to Serafina, his gray eyes storm dark with an anger she'd never seen directed on her behalf. "This is about me," she said quietly. "About the alliances I've been building, the influence I've been accumulating. Someone wants me to stop. Then they've made a catastrophic error in judgment." Lucien moved to the windows, scanning the street below like he might spot the threat lurking in broad daylight. "No one threatens my wife. I don't care what our relationship is or isn't. You're under my protection, and this is a declaration of war." The possessiveness in his voice should have irritated her. Instead, it awakened something she'd been trying to suppress. A dangerous flutter of feeling for this man who'd neglected her for weeks but now looked ready to tear apart anyone who dared threaten her. Serafina crushed that feeling ruthlessly. She couldn't afford softness, not now. "We need to think strategically," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "Reacting emotionally gives them exactly what they want: chaos, distraction, evidence that they can manipulate us." "You're being threatened, Serafina. Strategy can wait." "No, it can't." She stood, crossing to where he stood, rigid with fury. "This is precisely when strategy matters most. Someone wants me frightened, wants me to retreat back into being the decorative wife who doesn't interfere with the real power structures. If I let fear dictate my response, they win." Lucien studied her face, and something in his expression shifted, respect mixing with concern, admiration tangled with worry. "You're not afraid," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. "I'm terrified," Serafina admitted. "But I'm also angry, and anger is more useful than fear." Marcus Chen arrived within the hour, bringing with him 2 specialists who swept the penthouse for surveillance devices and secured the building's entry points. Former military, Serafina guessed from the way they moved, efficient, thorough, seeing threats in shadows that looked ordinary to civilian eyes. "The photograph was taken 3 weeks ago," Marcus said, studying the image with professional detachment, "which means whoever sent this has been tracking you for at least that long. They waited to make contact, probably gathering more evidence, building a file." "Evidence of what?" Lucien demanded. "She hasn't done anything wrong." "Depends on your definition of wrong." Marcus glanced at Serafina. "You've been building alliances outside the traditional family structures. Meeting with Victoria Castellano after your husband's family outmaneuvered hers. Joining a group of women who are consolidating their own power bases. To someone who sees that as a threat to the established order, you're a problem that needs to be contained." "Someone from one of the families?" Serafina asked. "Possibly. Or someone who profits from the current power dynamics and doesn't want them disrupted." Marcus set down the photograph carefully. "The question is whether this is just intimidation or a prelude to something more serious." The words hung in the air like a blade. "I want security on her immediately," Lucien said. 24/7, no exceptions." "That will signal weakness," Serafina objected. "It will show them their threat worked. It will show them you're protected. That touching you means going through me and everyone loyal to this family." Lucien's voice carried absolute authority. "I don't negotiate on this point." For once, Serafina didn't argue. Because beneath the strategic considerations, beneath her determination not to show fear, she was genuinely shaken. Someone had been watching her, tracking her movements, building a case against her influence. That kind of attention was dangerous in ways that went beyond business maneuvering. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "The magazine letters used for the message. I recognize the style. It's deliberately archaic, meant to obscure the sender's identity. But I've seen this before about 6 months ago." "Where?" Lucien asked. A threat sent to Arya Moretti, just before that stalking incident that was never resolved. The revelation hit Serafina like a physical blow. She saw Lucian's face pale, watched him make the same connection she was making with sick, dawning horror. You think the threats against Arya were... Lucien couldn't finish the sentence. I think someone has been orchestrating crises to manipulate your attention and resources for longer than we realized, Marcus said carefully. And now that same someone sees your wife as a threat to their influence. Serafina felt the pieces clicking into place with terrible clarity. The convenient emergencies that always required Lucien's immediate attention. The stalker who was never caught. The near accidents that left Arya shaken but unharmed. Even the cocaine arrest that had seemed like such bad timing. What if none of it had been random? What if it had all been carefully orchestrated theater designed to keep Lucien's focus exactly where someone wanted it? Arya, Lucien said, his voice hollow with realization. You think Arya has been... I think we need to investigate very carefully before making accusations, Marcus interrupted. But yes, the pattern is suggestive. Someone with access to her movements. Someone who benefits from keeping you constantly in rescue mode. Someone who would see your wife's growing independence as a direct threat to their position. Serafina watched Lucien process this, saw the man she'd married grapple with the possibility that 5 years of his life had been built on manufactured crises and calculated manipulation. The pain in his eyes was raw, visceral, and despite everything between them, she felt an unwanted surge of sympathy. We need proof, she heard herself say. Before we do anything, we need proof. Both men turned to look at her. If we accuse her without evidence, Serafina continued, forcing herself to think past the adrenaline, she'll deny everything. She'll position herself as the victim again, and will look like paranoid conspirators. But if we investigate quietly, build an airtight case, you want to use yourself as bait, Lucien said flatly. Absolutely not. I'm already bait. The threat was sent to me, not you. Whoever is behind this wants me frightened and contained. We can use that. Serafina's mind was working through scenarios with the cold precision she'd learned from her father. Let them think their intimidation worked. I'll pull back from my public activities, cancel meetings, act appropriately cowed. Meanwhile, we investigate. That's too dangerous, Lucien insisted. It's strategic. There's a difference. Serafina met his gaze directly. You want to protect me? Then help me be smart about this instead of just reactive. Marcus was nodding slowly. It could work. If we make them think they've won this round, they might get overconfident, make mistakes, give us the evidence we need. I don't like it, Lucien said. You don't have to like it. You just have to trust that I know what I'm doing. The charity event that evening was for pediatric cancer research, the kind of cause that brought out society's most prominent families in their finest clothes and their best public faces. Serafina had been planning to attend for weeks, and canceling now would send exactly the wrong message. So she went, wearing Marchesa and diamonds, Lucien at her side, and 2 discreet security personnel shadowing their movements. To anyone watching, they looked like the perfect power couple. United, formidable, unshakable. Only Serafina could feel the tension radiating from Lucien, the way his hand stayed possessively at her waist, the way his eyes tracked every person who approached them, with calculation bordering on paranoia. You need to relax, she murmured under the cover of applause for the opening speeches. You look like you're expecting an assassination attempt. Can you blame me? Someone threatened you this morning. And if they're here watching, they need to see me unafraid, us unbothered. Give them nothing to feed on. Lucien's jaw tightened, but he made a visible effort to ease the rigid set of his shoulders. I hate that you're better at this than I am. At what? Performing calm while internally screaming? Serafina smiled up at him, and to anyone watching, it probably looked adoring rather than sardonic. I've been practicing since our wedding night. The barb landed. She saw him flinch, saw regret flash across his features before he mastered his expression. Serafina. Not here. Not now. She turned her attention back to the stage where the event organizer was introducing the keynote speaker. We have an audience. But she felt Lucien's gaze on her throughout the evening, heavy with things unsaid and realizations coming too late to undo the damage already done. Arya made her entrance during the silent auction, commanding attention the way she always did, ethereal in pale blue silk, her blonde hair catching the light like a halo. Serafina watched her work the room with practiced grace, accepting sympathetic touches and concerned inquiries about her recent troubles with appropriate grateful humility. She was very, Very good at this. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and for a moment Arya's mask slipped. Serafina saw something calculating and cold flash across those amber eyes before the gentle smile returned. Then Arya was moving toward them with deliberate purpose. Lucienne, Serafina. She greeted them with air kisses that Serafina endured with practiced composure. What a lovely event, though I confess I'm surprised to see you here after... She trailed off delicately, and Serafina felt Lucienne tense beside her. After what? Serafina asked pleasantly. Oh. Arya's hand fluttered to her throat in that familiar gesture of delicate concern. I assumed Lucienne would have told you about the warning I received yesterday, someone claiming you were in danger, that I should stay away from both of you for your safety. She looked between them with perfectly performed worry. It was all very dramatic and frightening. I thought perhaps you'd received something similar. The performance was masterful. Arya had just positioned herself as both concerned friend and potential victim, while simultaneously fishing for information about whether Serafina had been threatened. Serafina saw Marcus's theory crystallizing into probability. This woman was playing a game that went far deeper than simple romantic rivalry. How strange, Serafina said lightly. We received no such warning. Did you report it to the police? I mentioned it to Lucienne, of course. Arya's gaze flickered to him with calculated vulnerability. I didn't want to make a fuss after everything that's already happened, but if you've been threatened too... We haven't, Lucian interrupted, his voice carrying an edge that made Arya's eyes widen fractionally. And if we had, I'm sure Serafina would handle it with her usual competence. The subtle shift in his tone, the way he'd positioned Serafina as capable rather than someone needing protection, the way he'd cut Arya off mid-manipulation, was so unexpected that both women stared at him. Arya recovered first, her smile never wavering despite the hardening of her gaze. Of course. Serafina is remarkably capable. I'm constantly amazed by her. The words were complimentary, but there was something underneath them that felt like a threat. I should let you both get back to the auction. I just wanted to make sure you were safe. She drifted away in a cloud of expensive perfume and barely contained fury, leaving Serafina and Lucian standing together in charged silence. She's lying, Lucian said quietly, about the warning, about her concern, possibly about everything. Probably, Serafina agreed, but we still need proof. I'm going to find it. The promise in his voice was absolute. Whatever she's done, whatever she's planning, I'm going to expose all of it. Serafina wanted to warn him about the danger of emotional investment, about the need to remain objective in their investigation. But looking at his face, at the betrayal and rage and determination written there, she understood this had become personal for him in ways that transcended strategy. He'd been manipulated, possibly for years, his protection instinct weaponized against him, his loyalty used as a leash. The man who'd built his identity on control and competence was facing the reality that he'd been thoroughly, expertly played. The attack came 3 nights later. Serafina was walking to her car after a dinner meeting with her father. Routine, predictable, the kind of pattern someone watching would anticipate. Her security detail was 10 steps behind, close enough to respond but far enough to give her space. It happened in the parking garage, in the shadows between overhead lights where cameras couldn't quite reach. 3 men materialized from between cars with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of military training or worse. They moved fast, professionally, one grabbing her from behind while the others moved to intercept her security. Serafina didn't scream. She'd been trained for this. Her father had insisted on self-defense classes from the time she was 12, understanding that daughters of powerful families were always potential targets. She drove her elbow backward into her attacker's solar plexus with every ounce of force she could muster, felt his grip loosen fractionally, used that split second to twist and drive her heel down on his instep. He grunted in pain, and she wrenched free just as her security detail engaged the other 2 attackers with brutal efficiency. The fight was savage and brief. Her detail had been chosen by Lucian personally, former special forces with the kind of training that made them devastating in close quarters. Within seconds, 2 of the attackers were on the ground, and the third, the one Serafina had injured, was fleeing toward a dark van idling at the garage exit. Her head of security, a man named James with a scar across his jaw and eyes that missed nothing, immediately positioned himself between Serafina and any potential threat. Are you hurt? No. Her voice was steady despite the adrenaline screaming through her system. Did you get them? 2 secured, the third got away. James spoke rapidly into his radio, calling for backup and police. Mrs. DeMarco, we need to move you to a secure location immediately. Not until we question them. Serafina looked at the two men now being restrained by her security team. I want to know who sent them. That's not James. She cut him off with the kind of authority she'd learned from watching her father command rooms full of powerful men. We're not calling the police, not yet. I want 5 minutes with them first. The security chief's expression suggested this was a terrible idea, but he also understood the reality of their world. Sometimes information was more valuable than justice, and the police asked questions that complicated situations rather than resolving them. He nodded once, sharp and professional. The interrogation happened in a maintenance room in the garage's lowest level, concrete walls and fluorescent lights creating an atmosphere that was claustrophobic and intimidating. Serafina stood with her arms crossed, her Valentino dress ripped at the seam, and her carefully styled hair coming loose from its pins, looking at the two men with the cold assessment of someone who'd just been attacked and wanted answers. Who sent you? She asked. Silence. The two men, professionals definitely, with the kind of blank expressions that came from training or fear or both, stared at the wall rather than meeting her gaze. Let me rephrase. Serafina's voice remained calm, conversational even. You just attempted to kidnap the wife of Lucien DeMarco. Do you understand what that means? The kind of resources he has access to, the people he knows, the things he's willing to do to people who threaten what's his? One of the men flinched almost imperceptibly. You can tell me who hired you, and maybe, we can find a way to keep you breathing through the next week. Or you can stay silent, and I promise you, what happens next will make you wish you'd died in this garage tonight. She wasn't bluffing. She'd grown up in this world, understood its ruthless logic. These men had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, and their survival depended entirely on their usefulness. The younger of the two, barely 25, with a scar across his eyebrow, broke first. We don't know names. We got hired through a dead drop, paid half up front, promised the rest on delivery. His voice carried an accent Serafina couldn't quite place. Just instructions. Grab you from the garage, take you to an address in Red Hook, wait for further contact. What were they planning to do with me? Didn't say. Just said to keep you secure and unharmed until they arrived. Unharmed. That was interesting. This wasn't meant to be a murder, it was meant to be leverage. Someone wanted her alive and contained, probably to force Lucian's compliance with something. The address in Red Hook, she said. Give it to me. He did, rattling off numbers that James immediately recorded. And the dead drop? Where did you receive your instructions? Coffee shop in Queens, envelope left at a specific table, money inside, target details, timeline. The man was talking faster now, sensing perhaps that cooperation was his only path to survival. We were supposed to deliver you by midnight tonight. That's all I know, I swear. Serafina believed him. These were hired muscle, not the architects of whatever plan was unfolding. But they'd given her something valuable, a location, a timeline, evidence of premeditation. James, secure them somewhere safe. Not the police, not yet. I need to talk to Lucien first. The call to Lucien lasted approximately 15 seconds before he was moving, his voice tight with barely controlled fury and fear. Are you hurt? I'm fine. They didn't... Where are you? She gave him the location, and he promised to be there within 10 minutes. True to his word, 9 minutes later, Lucien appeared in the parking garage with Alessandro and a team of men who looked like they ate nails for breakfast. Lucien took one look at her torn dress and disheveled hair, and his face went white, then red, then settled into an expression of such cold rage that even his own security detail took a step back. Who? The single word came out like a blade. We don't know yet, but we have leads. Serafina kept her voice steady, professional, refusing to let him see how shaken she actually was beneath the calm exterior. They were hired through an intermediary, paid to take me to a location in Red Hook and hold me there. Then we go to Red Hook. Alessandro's voice was granite, and we find out who's been orchestrating this. No. Serafina surprised all of them with the firmness of her refusal. We don't go charging in blind. We use this. We were supposed to be delivered by midnight. That gives us 3 hours to set up our own surprise. Lucien looked at her like she'd lost her mind. You were just attacked, Serafina. You're not using yourself as bait again. I'm not. But we can use the location, the timeline, the fact that whoever is behind this is expecting their plan to succeed. She turned to Alessandro. You have people who can handle this kind of operation? The old man's smile was sharp and dangerous. I have exactly the people we need. They planned it like a military operation because that's essentially what it was. A tactical response to a direct threat against one of their own. Alessandro made calls to people whose names weren't mentioned, who existed in the spaces between legitimate business and the kind of power that operated outside legal frameworks. Within 2 hours, they had surveillance on the Red Hook location, an abandoned warehouse near the waterfront, the kind of place that asked no questions and told no tales. Within 3 hours, they had a team in position, ready to identify whoever showed up expecting to collect their prize. Serafina wanted to be there, to see the face of whoever had orchestrated her kidnapping, but Lucien put his foot down with such absolute authority that even she couldn't argue. You've been through enough tonight. Let us handle this. So she waited in the penthouse, Alessandro staying with her while Lucien coordinated the operation from the warehouse. Victoria arrived within the hour, summoned by a text from Serafina that simply read, "Emergency, need you." The other woman took one look at Serafina's face and wrapped her in a hug that was surprisingly fierce. "Tell me everything." Serafina did, laying out the events of the past 3 days, the threat, the attack, the connections to Arya's previous crises. Victoria listened with the focused intensity of someone processing strategic implications in real time. "It's brilliant, really," Victoria said when Serafina finished. "If you look at it objectively, it's a masterclass in manipulation. Create dependency through manufactured crises, eliminate competition through intimidation and violence, maintain control by keeping everyone focused on protecting rather than questioning. Except we still don't have proof it's her." "We will." Victoria's confidence was absolute. People who play games this complex always make mistakes eventually. They get overconfident, they slip up, they leave evidence. Tonight might be when it all unravels. The call from Lucien came at 12:47 a.m. "We have her." Serafina's breath caught. "Arya?" "In the warehouse, waiting for her delivery. We have everything on camera. Her arrival, her instructions to the men she hired, her confession that she orchestrated all of it." Lucien's voice was hollow, scraped raw by betrayal. 5 years. She's been manufacturing crises for 5 goddamn years, and I fell for every single one. The pain in his voice made something crack in Serafina's chest. She should feel vindicated, triumphant even. Instead, she just felt tired, and sad, and furious on behalf of the man who'd chosen wrong, but was finally seeing clearly. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. "Now?" Lucien's laugh was bitter. "Now she faces consequences. Real ones. Alessandro is handling the legal aspects, fraud, extortion, conspiracy to commit kidnapping. She'll be lucky if she sees daylight before she's 40. And us?" Silence on the other end of the line, heavy with implication. "I'm coming home," Lucien said finally. "We need to talk." Serafina was standing at the window when Lucien arrived home at 2 in the morning. The city spread beneath her like a glittering reminder of everything they'd built and everything that had nearly been destroyed. She heard the door open, heard his footsteps cross the hardwood, but she didn't turn around. Not yet. "Serafina." His voice was raw, stripped of the careful control he usually wielded like armor. "Is it done?" she asked the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "Alessandro has her in custody. The evidence is overwhelming. Recordings, financial transactions, testimony from the men she hired. Her lawyers are already trying to negotiate, but there's nowhere left to run." He moved closer, and she could see his reflection joining hers in the glass. She confessed everything. The stalking incidents, the manufactured emergencies, even the cocaine arrest. She planted it herself to create another crisis that would bind me to her. 5 years, Serafina said softly. 5 years of your life built on calculated lies. Yes, the word was barely audible. I was so certain I was protecting her, being the hero she needed, and the entire time she was the threat. Serafina finally turned to face him, and what she saw made her chest tighten despite her best efforts to remain detached. Lucien looked destroyed, not just tired, but fundamentally broken in the way men break when they discover their reality has been fiction all along. "You're not responsible for her choices," she said, and meant it. "She's a sociopath who saw an opportunity and exploited it brilliantly. That's not a reflection of your judgment. It's a testament to her skill at deception." "Isn't it, though? My judgment?" Lucien laughed bitterly. "I married you, a woman of substance and intelligence and strength, and I treated you like an afterthought. I prioritized a manipulative fraud who was actively trying to destroy both of us over my own wife. That's not being deceived, Serafina. That's being catastrophically stupid. The admission hung between them, heavy with the weight of all the nights he'd left her alone, all the moments he'd chosen Arya over building something real with the woman he'd actually married. Why? The question escaped before Serafina could stop it, carrying months of hurt she'd tried to bury beneath strategy and competence. Why was it so easy for you to choose her over me, over and over again? Lucian moved to the bar with slow, deliberate steps, pouring 2 glasses of scotch with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. He handed one to Serafina, their fingers brushing in a moment of contact that felt electric after so much careful distance. Because she made me feel necessary, he said finally, meeting her eyes with brutal honesty. My entire life, I was raised to lead, to solve problems, to be the one people depended on. My father built an empire and handed me the responsibility of maintaining it. That's a weight, Serafina. A constant pressure to be strong enough, smart enough, ruthless enough to protect what's ours. He took a long drink, the scotch burning down his throat like penance. Then Arya appeared, this beautiful, fragile thing who needed protecting, who made me feel like more than just an heir or a business asset. She made me feel like a hero. Every crisis I solved, every time I saved her, it reinforced this idea that I was valuable beyond just my last name and my bank account. And I didn't need saving, Serafina said, understanding crystallizing with painful clarity. I was competent and capable, and I didn't stroke your ego by playing helpless. You are extraordinary. From the moment I met you, I could see you were my equal in ways Arya never was, and that terrified me. Lucien set down his glass with more force than necessary. Because equals can leave, equals have choices. But someone who needs you, someone whose entire world revolves around your protection, that feels safe, permanent. So you chose the comfortable lie over the complicated truth. Every single time, until tonight, when the lie tried to have you kidnapped, and I realized I'd been so busy playing hero for someone who never needed saving that I'd neglected the one person who actually mattered. The words should have filled Serafina with vindication, with the sweet satisfaction of being proven right. Instead, she just felt exhausted and sad and angry about all the time they'd wasted. I don't need a hero, Lucien. I never did. I know that now. I've watched you build alliances and outmaneuver rivals and command rooms full of people who thought you'd be decorative. You're formidable in ways I was too blind to appreciate. He took a step toward her, then stopped, as if uncertain of his welcome. But maybe, if you can forgive me for being an absolute fool, maybe you could use a partner. Someone who stands beside you instead of trying to shield you from the world. Serafina wanted to say yes immediately, to bridge the gap between them and forgive everything because the alternative was admitting their marriage was irreparably broken. But she'd learned over the past months that wanting something wasn't the same as it being wise. Words are cheap, Lucien. You've apologized before. Things were better for a few days, then Arya would have another crisis, and you'd disappear again. She met his gaze steadily. How do I know this time is different? How do I know you won't find another broken bird to rescue and forget about your wife all over again? Because I finally understand what I almost lost. Lucien closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. Tonight, when I got that call that you'd been attacked, something in me broke. Not because you needed me, you handled yourself before security even intervened, but because I realized that if they'd succeeded, if I'd lost you, I would have spent the rest of my life knowing I'd had something real and squandered it for something fake. That's fear talking. Fear isn't the same as commitment. You're right, so let me show you commitment. He pulled something from his pocket, a key, burnished gold and clearly expensive. This is to a property in Brooklyn Heights. 3 stories, original brownstone, completely renovated. I bought it 2 years ago as an investment, but I'm signing it over to you. Your name only, no connection to DeMarco Holdings or Vale Enterprises. It's yours, free and clear. Serafina stared at the key, trying to understand the gesture. Why would you give me a house? Because you should have an escape route that's entirely yours. Because I never want you to feel trapped in this marriage, or dependent on my goodwill. His voice was steady, certain. I'm not going to fix months of neglect with grand gestures or expensive gifts, but I can make sure you always have the power to leave if I fail you again. And knowing you could walk away at any moment, that will keep me honest in ways nothing else could. The strategy was sound, even brilliant in its way. By giving her independence, he was forcing himself to earn her continued presence. By ensuring she had options, he was acknowledging that her choice to stay would be exactly that, a choice, not a necessity. It was the kind of move Serafina herself might have designed, and that recognition made her smile despite the seriousness of the moment. "You've been learning," she observed. "I've been watching you, studying how you think, how you maneuver, how you build power structures that don't depend on anyone's permission." Lucien's expression was equal parts admiration and regret. "I should have been doing that from the beginning, instead of assuming I knew what kind of wife you'd be." "What kind of wife did you think I'd be?" "Honestly, I thought you'd be like my mother, elegant, supportive, content to manage the household while I managed the business. I thought our marriage would be comfortable and convenient, and ultimately forgettable." He laughed without humor. "Instead, I got a wife who's smarter than half my board, more strategic than my own father, and completely unwilling to accept being an afterthought. You've been extraordinary, and I've been blind." Serafina turned the key over in her hands, feeling its weight. A house. Freedom. The acknowledgement that she deserved both. "I need time," she said finally, "to trust that this isn't just another temporary shift. To believe that when the next crisis comes, because there will be another crisis, there always is, you won't revert to old patterns. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." Lucian's voice carried absolute certainty. "And neither is Arya, though for very different reasons. She'll be occupied with legal proceedings for the foreseeable future." "What will happen to her?" "Alessandro is being remarkably merciful, all things considered. Instead of pressing criminal charges that would send her to prison for a decade, he's offering a deal. She leaves the country, permanently, with enough money to start over somewhere that isn't here. In exchange, she signs documents admitting to everything and agreeing never to contact me or anyone associated with our families again. That's more generous than she deserves. Probably. But Alessandro wants this handled quietly. A trial would be messy, draw media attention, potentially expose aspects of our business we'd prefer remain private." Lucien shrugged. "Sometimes exile is more effective than imprisonment." Serafina understood the logic, even if part of her wanted to see Arya face more concrete consequences. But this was how their world worked. Problems were solved efficiently, without unnecessary public spectacle. "When does she leave?" "Her flight is tomorrow night. I'm told she's already packing." The finality of it settled over Serafina like a weight lifting. Arya Moretti, the specter that had haunted her marriage from its first night, would finally be gone. Not defeated in some dramatic confrontation, but simply removed like the problem she'd always been. "I should feel more triumphant," Serafina said quietly. "Instead, I just feel tired." "That's because you're not cruel. You never wanted to destroy her. You just wanted her to stop destroying us." Lucian reached out slowly, telegraphing his intention, giving Serafina time to move away if she wanted. She didn't. His hand cupped her face with a gentleness that felt like an apology and a promise combined. His thumb traced her cheekbone, and Serafina closed her eyes against the surge of feeling that threatened to overwhelm her careful composure. "I'm going to spend the rest of our marriage proving I chose right," Lucian said softly, "even if I was too stupid to realize it at first. Even if it takes years to undo the damage I've done. You're not my obligation or my accessory or my afterthought. You're my equal, and I will never forget that again." "Pretty words, Lucien." "Then let me prove them with actions." He leaned forward, pressing his forehead to hers in a gesture of intimacy they'd never shared. "Give me the chance to be the partner you deserve instead of the fool I've been." Serafina could have pulled away, could have maintained the distance that had kept her safe through months of loneliness and hurt, could have reminded him that trust was earned, not granted. Instead, she kissed him. It wasn't the tentative kiss of their wedding ceremony, performed for an audience of families and expectations. It was fierce and claiming and full of all the anger and hurt and desperate hope that had been building between them since the night he'd walked out on her. Lucien made a sound low in his throat, his arms coming around her to pull her closer, and Serafina let him. Let herself have this moment of connection after so many months of careful distance. Let herself feel the heat of him, the solid strength of his body, the way he held her like she was precious rather than merely valuable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Lucien rested his forehead against hers again. "Come to bed," he whispered. "Not because I've earned it, but because I want to hold my wife for the first time since we were married. No expectations, no assumptions, just us. finally starting over the way we should have begun. It was perhaps the most honest thing he'd ever said to her. Serafina took his hand and led him to the bedroom they'd been sharing but never truly occupying together. For the first time since their wedding night, Lucien stayed, held her through the darkness, their bodies curved together like quotation marks around a story that was finally being written the way it should have been from the start. The next 3 months were a revelation. Lucien didn't just apologize, he transformed. He canceled late meetings to have dinner with Serafina. He asked her opinion on business decisions and actually listened to her answers. He introduced her to investors not as his wife, but as his partner, making it clear her insights were as valuable as his. And slowly, carefully, Serafina let her guard down. It wasn't immediate trust. That would have been foolish after everything they'd been through. But it was the beginning of something that might eventually become trust, built on consistent actions rather than empty promises. Alessandro watched their evolution with undisguised satisfaction. During a board meeting 6 weeks after Aria's exile, he pulled Serafina aside with the kind of pride that made her chest tight. "You've been good for my son," the old man said. "Better than I expected, honestly. He's sharper now, more focused, less arrogant." "I didn't set out to change him," Serafina replied. "I just refused to accept being less than I am." And that's exactly what he needed, someone who wouldn't diminish herself to make him comfortable. Alessandro's expression turned serious. "I'm promoting you to the executive board, not as Lucien's wife, but as yourself. Your Miami proposal saved us millions, and your work with the Singapore investors has opened doors we've been trying to access for years. You've earned this." The promotion was announced the following week, and Serafina felt a surge of satisfaction that had nothing to do with her marriage, and everything to do with her own competence finally being recognized where it mattered. Victoria and her network of powerful daughters celebrated with champagne and gossip, and the kind of sharp strategic analysis that characterized their monthly meetings. "You've come a long way from the woman standing alone at her wedding reception," Victoria observed, raising her glass in toast. "Look at you now, executive board member, power broker in your own right, married to a man who's finally figured out what he has." "It's been a hell of a journey," Serafina agreed. "The best ones usually are." Elena Russo leaned forward, her expression speculative. "So what's next for the formidable Mrs. DeMarco? Now that you've conquered the business world and fixed your marriage, what's left?" Serafina smiled, thinking of the foundation she'd been planning with her mother, an organization to help women from their world navigate strategic marriages with dignity and agency intact. Thinking of the expansion plans she and Lucien had been developing together, true partnerships that leveraged both their strengths. Thinking of the life she was building that was finally hers on her own terms. "Everything," she said simply. "Everything is next." The charity gala 6 months after their wedding was different from all the ones before it. This time, when Serafina entered on Lucien's arm, she didn't feel like an accessory or an afterthought. She felt like the queen she'd become, powerful in her own right, commanding respect that had nothing to do with her last name and everything to do with what she'd built. Lucien seemed to sense the shift, the way people gravitated toward her rather than him, the way conversations paused when she spoke, the deference she commanded through competence and strategic brilliance. "How does it feel?" he murmured as they moved through the crowd. "Being the most formidable person in the room?" "Natural," Serafina replied with a smile. "Like it's what I was always meant to be. I'm sorry it took me so long to see it. You see it now. That's what matters." They worked the room together, a united front that was finally built on genuine partnership rather than strategic necessity. They finished each other's sentences during business discussions, supported each other's initiatives, presented a vision of power shared rather than competed for. It was during the silent auction that Lucien pulled her aside, his expression serious in a way that made her pulse quicken. "I have something for you," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Serafina's breath caught. "Lucien, it's not what you think. Or maybe it is, but not the way you're expecting." He opened the box to reveal a ring, not a wedding band or an engagement ring, but something more unusual. A thick platinum band with a single engraving, equals. "Our wedding rings were symbols of a transaction," Lucien said quietly. "This is a symbol of what we've actually built, a partnership between equals who choose each other every day rather than being chosen by family obligation." Serafina stared at the ring, her throat tight with emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the grand romantic gesture of romance novels. It was something more honest, more real, an acknowledgement that their marriage had started as strategy but had become something more substantial through the crucible of betrayal and hurt and hard-won understanding. "Will you wear it?" Lucien asked, and there was vulnerability in the question that made him seem younger, less certain. "Not instead of your wedding ring, but alongside it. A reminder that we're rebuilding this marriage as partners." Serafina held out her hand, and Lucien slid the ring onto her finger with the kind of reverence that felt like a vow. "Equals," she said softly, testing the word. "Equals," he confirmed, "in everything that matters." The kiss they shared was witnessed by half of New York's elite society, but Serafina didn't care. Let them watch. Let them see that the woman who'd been dismissed as decorative had become indispensable, that the marriage that started as strategy had transformed into something worth fighting for. When they finally pulled apart, Lucien's eyes were bright with something that looked suspiciously like unshed tears. "I love you," he said, and the words hit Serafina like a physical blow because they were the first time he'd ever said them. "I should have said it months ago. Should have felt it on our wedding night instead of realizing it the night you were attacked. But I'm saying it now, and I'll keep saying it until you believe me." Serafina cupped his face in her hands, this man who'd broken her heart, and then spent months painstakingly putting it back together. "I believe you," she said. "And Lucien, I love you too. Not the version of you I hoped you'd be, but the man you've actually become. The one who's willing to grow and change and admit when he's wrong. That man is worth loving." The smile that broke across his face was pure joy, uncomplicated by strategy or calculation. It transformed him from the controlled businessman into someone younger, lighter, more human. "Take me home," Serafina whispered, "to our home, where we can stop performing for everyone else and just be us." Lucien didn't need to be asked twice. 1 year after their wedding, Serafina stood in the Brooklyn Heights brownstone Lucien had given her, which she'd transformed into something extraordinary. The ground floor housed the foundation she'd established, a resource center for women navigating strategic marriages, offering legal advice, business counseling, and emotional support. The second floor was her private office, where she managed her growing portfolio of independent investments and business ventures. The third floor she kept for herself, a sanctuary that was entirely hers. She hadn't moved out of the penthouse she shared with Lucien. Their marriage had evolved into something real enough that she wanted to share a home with him. But having this space, this reminder that she always had somewhere to go if she needed it, kept their relationship honest. Victoria found her there on a Tuesday afternoon, reviewing applications for the Foundation's mentorship program. "You've built something remarkable," the other woman said, settling into the chair across from Serafina's desk. "In just 1 year, you've gone from neglected wife to power broker to philanthropist. It's impressive." "I had good teachers," Serafina replied. "You, my mother, Alessandro, even Lucien, in his own way. He taught me what not to accept." "And now? Are you happy?" The question was simple but profound. Serafina considered it carefully, thinking about the life she'd built from the ruins of that humiliating wedding night. "I'm satisfied," she said finally. "Happy feels too simple for what this is. But satisfied? Yes. I'm satisfied with who I've become, with the marriage I've forged, with the empire I'm building that's entirely mine." "That's better than happy anyway," Victoria agreed. "Satisfaction is earned. Happiness is just circumstance." They talked for another hour about business and strategy and the next phase of their network's expansion. When Victoria finally left, Serafina sat alone in her office, looking out at the city that had witnessed her transformation. Her phone buzzed with a text from Lucien. "Dinner tonight? I'm cooking." She smiled. He'd been teaching himself to cook over the past few months, determined to create moments of domesticity that were just theirs. He was terrible at it, but the effort mattered more than the result. "I'll bring wine," she typed back. "You always bring the good stuff. That's why I married you. I thought you married me for strategic alliance purposes. That too. But mostly for the wine." The banter was easy, affectionate, the kind of communication that came from genuine intimacy rather than performed connection. They'd built this over months of hard work and honest conversation, and the willingness to forgive without forgetting. That evening, Serafina returned to the penthouse to find Lucien in the kitchen, surrounded by the chaos of someone who was enthusiastic but incompetent at cooking. Smoke billowed from a pan, the fire alarm was beeping, and Lucien looked equal parts frustrated and sheepish. "I burned the chicken," he announced unnecessarily. "I can see that." Serafina opened windows while Lucian dealt with the smoke alarm. Should I order takeout? Probably, but I really wanted to do this right. Lucienne. She crossed to where he stood amid the wreckage of his culinary ambitions and wrapped her arms around him from behind. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to try. That's all I've ever asked. He turned in her embrace, pulling her close with the kind of casual intimacy that still felt new and precious. I'm trying, he said. Every day I'm trying to be the husband you deserve. I know. I see it. She stood on her toes to kiss him softly. Now let's order Thai food and pretend this never happened. They ate dinner on the terrace. The city spread beneath them like proof of everything they'd built and everything they'd survived. Lucienne told her about a new venture in Tokyo, asking her opinion on the cultural considerations. Serafina shared updates on the foundation, excited about a program that was already helping women in situations similar to what hers had been. They talked like partners, like equals, like two people who'd chosen each other every single day until the choosing became effortless. Later, as they lay in bed with Serafina's head on Lucian's chest and his hand playing with her hair in that absent way that meant he was content, he spoke into the darkness. Do you ever regret it? The way we started? Serafina considered the question honestly. Did she regret the humiliation of her wedding night? The months of loneliness? The betrayal and hurt and anger that had defined their early marriage? No, she said finally. Because if it had been easy, I never would have become this person. I would have been comfortable being your wife, letting that define me, never building my own empire. The pain forced me to grow, to become formidable, to refuse to accept less than I deserved. I hate that my stupidity was necessary for your evolution. Your stupidity wasn't necessary, but it happened, and I chose to use it as fuel rather than letting it destroy me. She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him in the dim light. We're stronger now than we would have been if everything had been perfect from the start. We've been tested and didn't break. That means something. Lucienne pulled her down for a kiss that was slow and thorough and full of the kind of passion that came from genuine connection rather than just physical attraction. I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never regret choosing to stay, he promised against her lips. Good. Hold me to that standard. Keep me honest about what I deserve. Serafina settled back against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heart. And Lucienne, I'm going to spend the rest of our lives making sure you never forget what you almost lost. That fear will keep us both sharp. His laugh rumbled through his chest. We're going to have a very interesting marriage. The best ones usually are. 2 years after their wedding, Serafina stood in the boardroom of DeMarco International, presenting a proposal that would fundamentally reshape the company's international operations. Alessandro sat at the head of the table, Lucienne at his right, and Serafina commanded the room with the kind of authority that came from knowing absolutely that she belonged there. When she finished, the board voted unanimously to approve her plan. Alessandro looked at her with undisguised pride, and Lucienne's expression held something more complex. Pride mixed with love, mixed with the kind of respect that came from watching someone exceed every expectation. Brilliant work, Mrs. DeMarco, Alessandro said, though perhaps we should start calling you co-CEO, given how much of this company's success is now attributable to your vision. The title doesn't matter, Serafina replied. The work does. But later, when Alessandro pulled her aside to officially offer her the position of co-CEO alongside Lucienne, she accepted with a satisfaction that ran bone deep. This was what she'd been building towards since that humiliating wedding night. Not revenge, not even vindication, but the simple, powerful reality of being recognized for exactly what she was, formidable, essential, and impossible to ignore. That evening, she and Lucienne celebrated with champagne on their terrace, the city lights reflecting in the glasses like captured stars. Co-CEOs, Lucienne said, clinking his glass against hers. Equal in every way that matters. Isn't that what you promised me? That we'd be equals? I did. I'm just continually amazed that you actually agreed to build this with me after everything I put you through. Serafina smiled, thinking back to the woman she'd been 2 years ago, naive enough to hope for love, vulnerable enough to be devastated by its absence, strong enough to forge something better from the ruins. I agreed because you proved you were worth the risk, because you changed when it mattered, because you gave me the power to leave and trusted that I'd choose to stay. She took his hand, the ring he'd given her catching the light alongside her wedding band. And because somewhere along the way, the marriage we were forced into became the partnership I actually wanted. Lucienne raised her hand to his lips, kissing her knuckles with the reverence that had become habitual over the past 2 years. I was a fool who got a second chance I didn't deserve. I won't waste it. I know you won't. I'm watching. They stood together in comfortable silence, two people who'd started as strangers bound by strategy and had become partners bound by choice. The journey hadn't been easy or painless, but it had been real. And in their world of calculated appearances and strategic alliances, real was rarer and more valuable than diamonds. 3 years after their wedding, Serafina sat in the Foundation's boardroom with her mother, Victoria, and the other women who'd helped her build this organization into something that mattered. They were discussing expansion plans, talking about opening additional centers in other cities, helping more women navigate the complicated intersection of power and marriage. "You've created something extraordinary here," Gabriella Vale said, looking at her daughter with the kind of pride that came from watching someone exceed even the highest expectations. "Something that will outlast all of us." "I had help," Serafina replied, looking around the table at the women who'd supported her transformation. "None of this would exist without all of you." "But you're the one who had the vision," Victoria insisted. "You're the one who took your pain and turned it into something that helps others. That takes courage we don't often see." After the meeting, Serafina's mother asked her to stay behind. "I need to tell you something," Gabriella said once they were alone. "An apology, really, for advice I gave you that was wrong." Serafina waited, curious. "I told you to accept that men like Lucien don't marry for love, that being valuable was safer than being beloved, that you should settle for respect and forget about affection." Her mother's voice was soft with regret. "I was speaking from my own experience, my own compromises. But watching you these past 3 years, I realize I should have told you something different." "What should you have told me?" "That you deserved everything. Respect and affection and partnership and love. That settling for less than your worth isn't strength, it's fear." Gabriella took her daughter's hand. "You didn't settle, and look what you built. A marriage that's real, a career that's yours, an empire that bears your mark. I'm proud of you for being braver than I was." Serafina felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears. "You survived your marriage with dignity intact. That took its own kind of bravery." "Perhaps, but you did more than survive. You thrived, and you changed the rules for women who come after you." Her mother smiled. "That's legacy, darling, the kind that matters." That night, Serafina told Lucien about the conversation with her mother. They were in bed, his arms around her in the way that had become their natural state. "She's right," Lucien said quietly. "You changed the rules. You changed me. You changed what's possible. We changed each other. That's what partnership means." "True. Though I think you did more of the heavy lifting in terms of actual change." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "I went from arrogant fool to slightly less arrogant partner. You went from overlooked wife to force of nature." "I was always a force of nature. You just couldn't see it at first." "My loss. Though I'm grateful you gave me the chance to eventually get my vision corrected." Serafina turned in his arms to face him. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if Arya's plan had succeeded? If she'd managed to keep us separated, to maintain her hold on you?" "All the time," Lucien admitted. "And it terrifies me, because I would have spent my whole life devoted to a lie while the real thing, the real love, the real partnership, was right there, waiting for me to wake up." His hand cupped her face with infinite gentleness. "I almost lost you before I ever really had you. That knowledge haunts me, but you didn't lose me. And I didn't give up on the possibility that you might eventually see clearly." She kissed him softly. "We're here now, that's what matters." "Here now, and for the rest of our lives," Lucien agreed, building something that started as strategy and became something real. 5 years after their wedding, Serafina stood in the same penthouse where she'd spent her wedding night alone. But everything was different now. The space had been transformed over the years, filled with evidence of their shared life, decorated with pieces they'd chosen together, marked by the 1,000 small intimacies that came from truly building a partnership. On the terrace, preparations were underway for a private celebration. Just their closest friends and family, gathering to mark not their wedding anniversary, which they celebrated quietly between themselves, but the anniversary of what they called their real beginning. The night Arya's betrayal was exposed and they'd finally started building something honest. Alessandro arrived first, older now, but still sharp, still commanding respect with nothing more than his presence. He embraced Serafina with genuine affection. "You've exceeded every expectation I had when I arranged this marriage," he told her. "You've been good for my son, good for our family, good for the business. But more than that, you've been good for yourself. That matters most. Thank you for seeing my potential when others just saw a strategic alliance. I see clearly. It's one of my few remaining talents." He smiled. "And I see that this marriage I orchestrated for practical purposes became something far better than I imagined. That's the best outcome an old man could hope for." Serafina's parents arrived next, Marco beaming with pride at his daughter's accomplishments, Gabriella elegant and knowing in that way that came from watching someone learn the lessons you'd tried to teach. Victoria and her network followed, bringing laughter and sharp conversation and the kind of loyalty that came from truly understanding each other's battles. When everyone was assembled, Lucien raised his glass in a toast. "5 years ago, I married a woman I barely knew for reasons that were entirely strategic. I thought I understood what that marriage would be. Convenient, comfortable, ultimately forgettable." He looked at Serafina with love so evident that several people made soft sounds of appreciation. "I was spectacularly wrong about all of it. This marriage has been inconvenient in the best ways, deeply uncomfortable in terms of forcing me to grow, and absolutely unforgettable." Serafina felt her throat tighten with emotion. "You taught me that partnership means choosing someone every single day, not just once at an altar. That love earned through adversity is stronger than love assumed from the start. That being equals means celebrating each other's strength instead of fearing it." Lucian's voice carried absolute certainty. "I was a fool who got lucky beyond measure. Here's to the woman who refused to accept being anyone's afterthought and became my everything instead." The toast was met with applause and tears, and the kind of collective joy that came from watching two people find something real in the most unlikely circumstances. Later, when the party had wound down and it was just the two of them on the terrace under the stars, Serafina leaned against the railing and thought about the journey that had brought them here. From the humiliation of her wedding night to the terror of being attacked to the satisfaction of building an empire entirely her own. From sleeping alone in a king-size bed to sharing it with someone who actually chose her every single day. From being overlooked to being essential. "What are you thinking?" Lucien asked, coming to stand beside her. "That I wouldn't change any of it. The pain, the betrayal, the months of loneliness, all of it was necessary to become who I am now." "You're extraordinary," he said simply. "We're extraordinary," she corrected. "What we've built together, what we've survived together, what we've become together, that's what's extraordinary." Lucien pulled her into his arms, and they stood there in comfortable silence. Two people who'd started as strategic allies and had become true partners in every sense that mattered. "I love you," Serafina said into the darkness. "Not the way I thought I would on our wedding day, but better, deeper, more real." "I love you too," Lucien replied. "More than I knew was possible. More than I have words to express. More than I deserve, but exactly as much as I intend to earn every single day for the rest of our lives." The city spread beneath them, glittering with infinite possibility. They'd built their empire here, not just businesses and foundations and strategic alliances, but something more fundamental, a partnership that was truly equal, a marriage that was chosen rather than arranged, a love that was earned rather than assumed. Serafina had transformed from the woman who'd stood alone in her wedding dress to the woman who commanded boardrooms and built foundations, and never, ever accepted being anyone's second choice. And Lucien had transformed from the man who'd left his wife on their wedding night to the partner who would never make that mistake again. Together, they'd turned a strategic alliance into an empire built on mutual respect, hard-won trust, and the kind of love that only comes from truly seeing each other clearly. It wasn't the fairy tale Serafina had secretly hoped for on her wedding day. It was something better, something real, something chosen, something built brick by brick through adversity and determination and the refusal to settle for less than they both deserved. And as they stood together under the stars, 5 years wiser and infinitely stronger, Serafina knew with absolute certainty that this partnership, this empire, this love, was worth every moment of pain it had taken to forge. They had chosen each other, finally and completely. And they would keep choosing each other every single day for the rest of their lives. That was the real victory. Not revenge against the woman who'd tried to destroy them, not vindication for the humiliation endured, but the simple, powerful reality of building something true from the ashes of what was meant to be merely strategic. They were equals now. Partners. King and queen of an empire they'd built together, ruling not through manipulation or deception, but through mutual respect and genuine love. And Lucien DeMarco never chose wrong again.